I'm Andy. I'll talk a little bit more about my background work in a while, but most of the time these days I'm spending discussions around what's happening in the regulatory space, around things that impact broadly on privacy, cybersecurity, online harms, and similar. And it was kind of timely that Nathan asked me if I wanted to do something with you guys because I don't know if you've been following the UK news on this stuff, but it's all gone quite mad at the moment. And that's my academic interpretation of events. And it does, for someone of my age, I'm 53 now. I finished my degree in 96, finished my PhD in 2000, and Steve Fennell, who I think you probably heard myself and Nathan talking about, who he didn't found this group, but he's certainly very involved in the growth of this group for a long period of time now. He's at Nottingham University now. Have spoken a great deal in the past about how no one seems to learn from history in this stuff, which might explain why these things keep on occurring. But I think there's some very significant privacy issues around what's currently being proposed. But it also ties back very, very strongly with the broader debates around crypto wars and encryption and things like that. So I'm just going to sort of bounce around and talk about some of those things. And like I said, if folk do want to follow up and check out anything I've written in more detail, I'm very happy for you to do that. So a little bit more about me. As you might have just like inferred from my conversation with Nathan, I do write a lot of books. The reason I write books is because, first of all, they're more accessible to policymakers and lawyers and the wider workforce than if something's locked in an academic journal. And bizarrely, books generally come out quicker than journal pieces. So that photograph there is a bunch of the books I've written over the years that's on my shelf behind me. I spend quite a lot of time writing stuff in legal journals as well on this stuff because obviously at the moment there's so much talk about tech regulation and there's a lot of people who don't understand the technology behind it who are making proposals. So I do quite a lot of work in law journals and yeah, I also have in the past been asked a great deal to work with the media on these sorts of things. So the thing at the back there is a piece I did on teen sexting law for the Daily Mail of all places a few years ago now. Those of you that are aware of the Daily Mail might go, what the hell are you interacting with those people for? Because Daily Mail is a pretty problematic output, but it's one that politicians read. And we are very uncomfortable with some of the legislation around these issues and having it in the Daily Mail and actually seeing readers' comments going, yeah, it is ludicrous. The law needs to be changed and things is are all things. So that's kind of broadly the sorts of things I do. It's very much around the online harms, the policy and regulatory and governance side of cybersecurity and increasingly stuff around privacy again. But unusually for people in this area, my background is technical. So I was writing AI code in the 90s, which is why when people talk about the fact that artificial general intelligence is on the way, it really isn't. But I can remember the last AI hype wave, and I just saw an article the other day from the Harvard Business Review saying, for those of you looking at technical careers and maybe worrying that coding is going to be automated in the future, so you won't have technical careers, there's been a new article come out from the Harvard Business Review saying that actually AI tool deployment in technical companies makes staff busier, not less busy. So yeah, but yeah, that's just a bit of background to myself. But I really want to focus on the problematic direction the UK government is going in at the moment and why they are doing it and what the implications of that are, because it when you start to unpick it, it starts to really not make a lot of sense. So I want to kind of reflect on, all right, well, if it doesn't make sense, why do they keep on doing it? And I think I'll start off with this recent quote from the Home Secretary. So the person basically in charge of the law and policing in the UK is talking fondly about something that Jeremy Bentham, who was a 18th century philosopher, talked about, and had this prison design called the panopticon, which basically means people in the prison can only be seen by the prison guards, which set at the center of this thing, and the only person they can see is the prison guard, and the prison guard in the center can see everybody. So it was viewed as a means of using surveillance to control the behavior of individuals. But the origins of the panopticon were very much wrong. These are people who have breached the social contract in society, and as a result of that, they are in prison. Therefore, maybe their rights to privacy should be withheld to some degree. Um, but this is the Home Secretary saying that, she thinks that, with the use of AI and technology now, we could have a, a, a nationwide panopticon. So we can use leading edge digital technology so people know that we are watching them the whole time. And I don't know about any of you, but that sort of thing worries me, because the panopticon wasn't proposed as a perfect solution for a flourishing and positive society. It was proposed as a means of controlling prisoners. So when a Home Secretary, and she has stepped back from this comment a bit, because as you might imagine, privacy campaigners and civil liberties groups, there's an organisation I work with quite a lot called the Open Rights Group, and they immediately responded to this going, this is really, really problematic, because, we have always been of the view that if you are behaving in a lawful way, you have certain rights, such as the right to privacy. Interestingly, David Cameron, when he was Prime Minister, said something very similar this as well. So you can see how surveillance appeals to governments, but we have rights frameworks in place. We have lots of social challenge in place to say that this isn't acceptable for everybody. But at the moment, there's a really interesting thing happening in arguably the child protection world, which I think ties strongly back into this sort of thing. And that is, it's been proposed. Now, this isn't actual legislation, but this has been proposed as an amendment to a piece of legislation that's emerging at the moment, that we should make it illegal for young people to use VPNs. Now, I'm not going to go into the complexities and the social contortions of VPNs now, and the fact that while VPNs are a useful privacy preserving technology, not all VPNs are equal, and you might be exposing yourself to additional risk if you use certain free VPNs and things. I'm fully aware of that, but I'm going to focus on the fact that this is a government that are proposing that we should make it illegal for young people to use VPNs, because it's been argued that this is problematic because of the way other legislation has gone in terms of keeping children safe online. So where this has basically come from is, I'll explore it in more detail in a moment, but in July, I don't know if any of you are aware, but legislation was enacted because the UK's Online Safety Act came out in 2023. I've promised a publisher I'll write a book in 2028, 5 years after its enacting, to talk about why it failed. That's how confident I am that it's going to fail. That's for a different talk, though. But in 2023, it came out and proposed that adult content providers needed to prevent young people from accessing their services. Now, I am not here to say I think it's all right for kids to look at porn, because it really isn't. And there's lots of really problematic things associated with that. But the way they propose to do it is to say to these providers that you need to put age gating in place. And then as soon as age gating was put in place, people started to use things like VPNs to bypass it. So the government reaction to that is then to say, well, if they're using VPNs in this single use case to bypass these things, when we don't want to do that, what we'll do is make it illegal for them to use VPNs. And then you push back and go, right, how do you know it's a child that's trying to gain access to VPNs? It's like, oh, we can use age verification for that. So you end up with this really interesting cycle, sort of a downward spiral. I think one of the central aspects of what I do at the moment is trying to unpick that if we're talking about something as intangible as harmful, because if we say we want people's privacy to be preserved, that's pretty well defined in law, in rights, or we want people to be free from something like sexual exploitation, that's pretty well defined. But say we want people to be not exposed to harm, that's really, really intangible. That's like trying to stick a cloud in a box, which is why maybe these pieces of legislation seem to be on a downward spiral of prevention, circumvention, etc. But I think, going back to what I was saying about my discussions with dear Professor Fennell and history, is that there are quite strong parallels with other aspects of cybersecurity in here. And some of you might have come across the crypto wars. I don't know whether you cover it in curriculum or anything. But there has been a long history of government saying that privacy is a good thing. However, encryption, while it is a good thing, it might also be a bad thing. So can they have a backdoor into it, please? And that becomes quite problematic. But let's have a look at the VPN debate first of all. So the thing that happens immediately is as soon as a new piece of tech law is enacted, the journalists go and get a bunch of kids together and go, "Can you get around this, please?" And within a day, kids were going, "Yes, it's an absolute doddle to get around." And one of the things they were saying was they were using VPNs. One of them said they had a selfie of their dad, which they just held up to the camera because the way that most age estimation systems are working on these platforms is to take a selfie or to hold your face up to the camera, and then they determine whether you look over age or not. So some young people were saying that, yeah, I used a picture of my dad. Someone was saying they used a particular internet celebrity because that was quite funny for the reporting. And some of them said, well, we use VPNs. Why do VPNs work? Well, this is a geographically restricted piece of legislation. So they are saying to the adult content providers, if you have a user connect from the UK, you have to put the age gate up. Because, again, I could do a whole hour on this as well, the extraterritoriality of some of this legislation. You still have governments acknowledging that they should possibly only regulate stuff that impacts on their citizens. If any of you are interested in this area, there's a pushback in the States at the moment called the Granite Act, because in the US, they're very focused on their First Amendment freedom of speech rights. And there's a lawyer over there that has written a piece of pushback legislation that says that if UK and EU governments are trying to stop American companies expressing their right to freedom of expression, they are doing something illegal as well. So it's, in my area, it's really interesting times. But going back to this, so they're using a VPN because if they're using a VPN, then they're connecting to the adult site, and the adult site doesn't know they're from the UK, therefore it lets them in. As a result of that, the technology secretary came out a while ago and said, we need a consultation on this because VPNs are problematic. I really interestingly, one of the political debates was around this because Nigel Farage came out and said this is ludicrous. Everyone gets around them with VPNs anyway. And the government minister at the time said something along the lines of, paedophiles would use VPNs. Make no mistake, Jimmy Savile would have used a VPN, which seems to be a really problematic argument if you are taking that extreme perspective. That seems to be really worrying. And I recently published an article called Would Jimmy Savile Have Used a VPN, which does unpick that and explore that. Now, in Australia, they're a little bit further ahead than we are here, and they put a social media ban in place a few months back now, and that was age gated as well. And this report came out just last week, which is of interest to me, because most of the media reporting is now saying, well, kids have already found circumvention. It's really quite straightforward. And yeah, the article's well worth reading because there's a 14-year-old lad in it who looks about 20. And he's like, oh, I just put my face up and it lets me through. So, it demonstrates the technical flaws of these sorts of things. But we have within the UK now got to a point where they're saying, well, if they use VPNs to circumvent them, we'll have to stop them using VPNs, even though we agree that young people do have a right to privacy and VPNs are a way of implementing privacy. Now, here's some stats for you. When you look at age gating and age verification technology, the view of some governments is, oh, it's been implemented now, they can do it. Now, there was a really interesting firm, the National Institute for Science and Technology in the US, a couple of years ago now, that benchmarked these age verification, age estimation technologies. And there's a couple of things. I mean, I'm not going to dwell on the numbers here too much at all. But what it really pointed out, while these things are effective, they are also flawed. And if you look at some of the numbers here, it's the proportion of people of that age who would be allowed through. But the T equals here is they're testing to see whether someone between the ages of 14 and 17 are under the age of 25, not under the age of 18. Because if you look at the graph down the bottom here, when the challenge age drops to 18, you're around 50% accurate. So what this, and it was well received by the age estimation industry. They didn't go, this is outrageous, they're deliberately fudging this. They did say, yeah, that actually ties in with our benchmarking as well. So you have on the one hand politicians saying that this technology is solid and this technology is fine. And on the other hand, you've got the actual providers and the benchmarkers going, it really isn't. Now, you might say, and this is where you get into moral debates around this sort of thing, well, if it works for the majority of people, that's an offset we're willing to take. But if you go back to the rights-based position on this, adults have a legal right to access adult content. There's nothing that's saying here that this should be used to prevent people accessing illegal content. That's very well defined in law. This is legal adult content. So if you're then saying there will be people 18, 19, 20, 21 who are then blocked from accessing this legal content because the age estimation system reckoned they were too young, that starts to become quite problematic from a rights-based perspective. But also it becomes quite problematic from a young person's rights-based perspective if they are then proposing that we need to verify the ages of children at multiple stages to make sure that they can use this technology to circumvent the technology. You can see how it immediately becomes a mess. And I think the 25 is really important as well. I don't know how old folk on this Zoom are, but I don't know if any of you have been challenged about buying alcohol in supermarkets. I don't drink. I'm ridiculously straight edge. But my kids, the standard joke here is my kids who are 8 and 9, they're not, they're 22 and 23. But my kids do. So occasionally, if they're home, they say, "Can you pick me up some booze?" And I'll go to the supermarket, I'll pick up some booze. It gets scanned through. The little red light flashes at the self-service checkout. Someone comes along. And within about half a second, the person doing the checking looks at me, then looks at the button and presses. This person is clearly over the age of 25, which is heartbreaking. It's still heartbreaking. But but why is 25 set? Because what we're saying with a human-based verification system is that humans can't determine whether someone is 18 or not. If we set it to 25, yeah, we're going to capture most people who aren't going to be. If we set it to 18, then we're in a whole different ballpark because there are some people who are 18 who look a lot younger. There are some people who are 18 that look a lot older. There are some people over 18 who look younger. So if we're proposing that human systems are fallible, therefore we set the age to 25, why are we then proposing that these age estimation systems are so effective they should be used in this case, and we can withdraw the right to privacy from young people in these cases because they are using a privacy enhancing technology in one case to bypass a specific use case, and we don't want them to do that. Going back to what I said earlier, I don't know many people in this area who think young people should have access to pornography. But we're not saying they should. We're saying that what you're proposing is not going to work. So maybe you should look at investing in, mad progressive stuff like better education and critical thinking and things like that instead. So there's really a number of tensions going on here. You have the proposal that we need to keep people safe online. The government, hilariously, a few years ago, and I still use this in my writing all the time, proposed that they're going to make the UK the safest place to go online in the world. Which is a really weird thing to say, given that the being online is a global phenomenon. And there was a guy called John Perry Barlow years ago that wrote the manifesto of cyberspace, which was really interesting if you check it out, because he basically said, governments, can you stop trying to regulate this space because this space is global and it transcends geographical boundaries. Now, I wouldn't necessarily agree that it's an unregulated space or an unregulatable space, but equally, governments doing geographically restricted ways of controlling it is quite odd. So to say we're going to make this country in this global space the safest place to go online is kind of interesting ambition in itself. We generally agree that privacy is a good thing. It's enshrined in EU law, it's enshrined in the ECHR, it's enshrined in the UN Convention on the Rights of the Child. But they're not absolute rights. They're rights that are subject to challenge, which is, generally speaking, fine. But generally speaking, governments agree that, they have no right to interfere with people's private conversations. Now, there is a discussion that's often had in this sort of thing, and if we're talking about, interception of communications and things and private communications, there is a view that will say, I've got nothing to hide. I don't worry if people read my emails and stuff like that. Now, the pushback is always, well, can we stick CCTV cameras in your home? Because if you've got nothing to hide, what is the threshold for privacy in this context? But also there's a concept of autonomy at play here, in that on the one hand, we want young people to grow up and want to have them as active, engaged members of society. On the other hand, we're saying, yeah, but you're not safe enough to deal with this yourself, so we're going to have to take over some of your rights and deal with it. But when you're 18, knock yourself out. We can't do anything about that. And online safety governance, which is probably why I've spent so long in this area, is so complex because it tries to balance these sort of things out. And back in 2012, there were big government proposals about how we had to put filters in every home to prevent access to adult content by children in the home, and that proved to be quite problematic because it would generally try and block on keywords. So rather famously, and it's something I always go back to, I think Facebook actually sorted this out now. Plymouth Hoe was viewed as problematic with these filtering systems. Why is that? Because one of the words with Plymouth Hoe is a pejorative term. I once got a warning on Facebook for referring to Plymouth Hoe because they said it was hate speech. I know people at Meta, so I went, can you tell your engineers that it's a location, not a person? But whenever you're proposing using technical solutions for this sort of things, you seem to end up in problematic areas, is basically what I'm saying here. But it's difficult if you're always viewed as being difficult if you do push back and go, technically you're not going to be able to do this. There's going to be problems with that. Because then it's like, well, what, you want children to be harmed, do you? Which is where the discourse has become. There is a theory. Look at this. It's magnificent, isn't it? I use ChatGPT to do this. Oh, it's terrible. But because I had an old version of this image and it was really ropey. So there is a geek theory called the Four Horsemen of the Infocalypse, which says that if you want to get public opinion on your side about an emerging piece of technology, you say it's used by terrorists, sexual exploiters, or paedophiles, organized crime, or money laundering. Because if you say, "Oh, encrypted communication," it keeps things quiet, but it's quite difficult for police and governments to be able to access those communications. It's unlikely you're going to go, "Oh yeah, I can see that that's really quite problematic. Maybe we shouldn't use encryption after all." But if you're to say a paedophile groomed a child using an encrypted channel, do you think that's a good thing? You're probably not going to go, "Yeah, I think that's a good thing." You're probably going to say, "Oh, actually, that is quite problematic. Yeah, I can see there are some use cases where maybe encryption is problematic." Now, interestingly, I spoke to a child protection copper about this a while ago. She's friends with my wife. And she said, the internet's brilliant. We used to have people exchanging images in like pubs and cafes and things, and there was no audit trail at all. Now we've got the means to be able to track people, and yeah, if they have criminal suspicion, they can monitor and surveil people. She wasn't of the view that encryption was a bad thing. She was kind of like going, we've got so many more tools now than we did. It's a step forward. Yeah, we can't monitor everyone's communications, but we don't have the resources to monitor everyone's communications either. But yeah, again, this is something, there's something else. I'll talk about Raynham's law when I finish off. But the Four Horsemen has been something that's been talked about in geek culture for quite a long time, as an observation that whenever a new innovation comes out, governments will try and gain public opposition to it by proposing that bad people use it. There is this recurring pattern, and it's something I experience quite a lot, or when the media used to phone me and I didn't say no to them all the time, is there would be a new technical phenomenon come out, for example, and then someone would phone me up and go, Fortnite's just come out. What are the problems with it? Go, well, it's not very good, but apart from that, what do you mean problems? Well, might there be paedophiles on it? Go, yeah, there might be, but there's also loads of kids just playing games. But there's a triggers of safety concern, then there's calls for exceptional access to this thing, because if there is potentially criminal activity happening in these spaces, we should be able to see it. Then there's pushback, then there's partial compromise, then there's bad policy, then there's a repeat. So while the VPN debate for some people is viewed as something new, actually, I'm not convinced it really is. We have had debates for a long time over encryption, and there has been a recent one around the introduction of encryption to Facebook Messenger. So Meta announced a few years ago that they were going to introduce end-to-end encryption into Facebook Messenger, and lots of child protection charities who might have a vested interest because their funding is based upon fear and moral panic, but that's again for a different talk. And come out and said, this is outrageous, this is terrible. But rather than saying there are some cases where encrypted communication might be used for criminal activity, therefore we're concerned about this and we might look at alternative ways of monitoring, They say encryption is bad because paedophiles use it. Yes, they do, but so do my kids when they're messaging me to say, "Can you pick me up some cider from Tesco's?" Um, and that's a far less contentious communication, but the rhetoric becomes ramped up very, very quickly. But we've been here before. There was a guy called Philip Zimmerman who designed PGP, Pretty Good Privacy, which is a way of putting trusted third-party encryption into your emails back in the day before emails were encrypted by default. And I can remember using it. I don't know if you can remember using it, Nath, but we certainly deployed it within the research lab um, as a way of encrypting communication. And it was all he made it entirely open source. He made it free to use, and he was arrested under US export laws because they said he was producing a piece of technology that might be used by enemies of the US for attacks against the US. Now, he launched his own defense. And again, you can read about it, check it out on Wikipedia. He launched his own defense and talked about how preposterous this was, because what he was basically doing is implementing some maths. And how people used it wasn't really down to him, but there were lots of very reasonable reasons why people wanted privacy in their communications. And that's part of the American Constitution, that people should be private to have communications themselves. And there was pushback, and in towards the turn of the century, the White House shifted to say that actually they thought encryption was quite a good thing, but not before. There was something released in the mid-90s called the Clipper chip. Again, look it up, where US security agencies developed a chip that was, they wanted technology providers to use it in devices like phones and things because it provided an encryption, but it also provided a backdoor to that encryption for law enforcement professionals. As you might imagine, it didn't really fly. But again, it's kind of like, right, encryption is sometimes used for bad things, therefore we need some way of controlling it. And over again, you've got all these different issues around this stuff. And on top of the government concern, you have public narratives around this sort of thing as well, which say, these things are bad. If you're using a VPN, it's like, well, you're just protecting your privacy. Perfectly reasonable thing to do. Oh, okay. I thought it was used by pedophiles. You always come back to those sorts of things. But should this stuff be essential for messaging? Well, it seems reasonable in the same way that if you're having a conversation with someone at a cafe, you're not saying that the cafe owner has to provide microphones and broadcast technology in the salt and pepper pots to feed back to government to say these people are having a conversation, we need to monitor it. To say that most of the time we have we have a right to have private communications. And what happens is you get proposals that say, all right, you can still have private communications, but can you put a back door into it? And it becomes quite ludicrous because something is either encrypted or it's not encrypted. As soon as you start putting back doors into things, you start to weaken the security of these sorts of things. And there's lots of proposal. There is currently an issue between the UK government and Apple. So those of you that are daft enough to use Apple products can't use the top level of secure cloud storage, I believe, because there was a Home Office challenge against Apple that wasn't reported on, and it hasn't been recorded, but there was a case that happened in the courts to say that that level of security wasn't acceptable to the British government. But essentially what you're trying to do is change maths. If you're saying, can you make it encrypted but not encrypted for us? Encryption's maths. Maths is an absolute. And there was certainly a case with, I think it was Greek Telecom, who did introduce backdoors for security services into their telecommunications infrastructure. And within 2 or 3 days of deployment, these things were hacked because, you can't have an algorithm that goes, you're a goodie or a baddie. We'll let you in if you're a goodie, but if you're a baddie, no, we're going to keep it. It becomes ludicrous. And the whole concept of a goodie or baddie is entirely subjective anyway. And then you go back to the argument that Facebook were going to introduce encrypted communications into their messenger platform, and how outrageous that was, and how that was providing a solution for pedophiles. And then you reflected on it and you went, yeah, but you've already got tons of apps that already provide encrypted communications. All Facebook were doing with Facebook Messenger is bringing it up to standard. And I certainly know because I talk to people. You know that there will be politicians on WhatsApp groups having WhatsApp group chats talking about how bad encryption was, and then that becomes perfectly ludicrous. I put a star with Telegram there because Telegram claims it's encrypted, but they also claim that they can access content themselves. So, don't know. Signal. If you want to follow a platform that does this stuff really well, and certainly in terms of their public messaging as well, Signal are very good. Meredith Whittaker, who is like the chief executive or chair of Signal, is always very, very eloquent, talking about the importance of the value of privacy and encryption and similar. And you end up with this cycle of of criticism and abuse. So Apple were also challenged in the States a while ago. Bizarrely, someone I went to school with, who is now quite a big deal in the States, in IT in the States, was working for Apple at the time. He was actually in the room. That basically they had a terrorist attack. They found the guy's phone. They couldn't decrypt the phone. So they went to Apple and said, you need to give us access to this phone. And Apple pushed back and said, no, we're not going to. And yeah, my school friend was literally in the room being shouted at by FBI agents. But at that time they pushed back. But there is concern that because of the pressure from politicians and similar providers are starting to say, well, maybe there are other ways of doing this. I mean, client-side scanning has been proposed as a way of doing it. So you have an algorithm on your phone that looks at what you're about to send or looks through what you're about to send and makes a determination on whether it's harmful or not then. And privacy experts and similar have been pushing back on that and going, yeah, I'm not sure that's acceptable either, because you're not breaking the encryption, and you're not interfering with communication, but you are expecting a private company to make ethical decisions on the harm or non-harm on the device. And then the European Union came out and said, we're not going to say you can't have encrypted communications. And then there was massive pushback from child abuse charities and child protection specialists and similar, going, this is terrible. This is going to make children more vulnerable. So yeah, you end up in this ridiculous downward spiral. And yeah, you have pushback, and you have it's really interesting, because if you were to ask me this 2 years ago, I'd probably be quite pissed off about it and going, this is ludicrous, this is ridiculous, this why can't people do this? Now I've kind of become quite stoic about it and gone, well, it gives me stuff to write about, doesn't it? Because if I think I said right at the start, I do quite a lot around the use of social theory to understand why these things happen. And if everyone was going, right, encryption's great and kids have a right to privacy and we need to have progressive education, I'd be kind of sat there going, oh, yeah, they're doing good things at the moment. Whereas if there are problematic things occurring, and understanding the motivations of stakeholders in the space and similar, it's yeah, it certainly gives me stuff to write about. But yeah, you have this recurring pattern, and you do have this this cycle. It probably goes in about 5-year cycles, and there's no coincidence it goes in 5-year cycles, because governments change in 5-year cycles, and new people come in to advise governments in 5-year cycles as well. So, and no one ever goes, yeah, you tried this 10 years ago. Because while the Online Safety Act has a lot of stuff about age verification in it, literally 5 years before the Digital Economy Act had exactly the same expected regulation around age verification and adult content providers. But that legislation was jettisoned after being enacted because there were too many privacy concerns. So literally 5 years ago, they tried to do it, and it didn't work. But children are becoming the new justificatory figure, because it's far more difficult to push back and go, no, I don't want kids to be harmed. However, I don't think what you're proposing is going to stop that, because if you've got someone going, oh, but we know that they bypass this, we've got evidence that suggests young people accessing pornography at an early age can lead to problematic behaviours in the future. So we need to stop them from accessing it. But you're saying we shouldn't do this, therefore you want children to be harmed. The same way as, if you take exception to encrypted communication, you want children. So children become this new justificatory figure, and it becomes a very powerful justificatory figure, and obviously more difficult to challenge. And how could I not go through a talk like this without taking the quote from The Simpsons about, please God, will someone think of the children? And yeah, I think I was talking to Nathan at the start, saying I turned down requests to go and to have discussions about whether we should have smartphone bans for children under 16 or whatever, because you are literally sat either in a radio studio or in a TV studio with someone who is virtually in tears because they care so much about children and they believe that the only way we can save children is to do this, and they've read a paper that says that it's harmful. And you're sat there going, ah, it's more complicated than that. You're only ever going to come across as difficult or uncaring in those sorts of situations. Because if you're a champion of children, then obviously you care about them. But really, is that really what's happening here? Or are we? There's a wonderful book called Unequal Childhoods by a sociologist called Annette Leroux that proposes that the middle classes like to carve out their entire child's life, and she did an amazing ethnography around it. She sat with families and saw this stuff occurring. And is it concerns about safety that frame this, or are there concerns about control that frame this? Because if you say, I'm concerned about what my child's doing on their device, therefore I need to be able to see it, therefore we need to erode their privacy to do it, that's one thing. But saying my child has some part of their life that I don't know about, and as a middle class parent, I need to know about it because I need to control it. Therefore, I can't control it. Therefore, I'm going to propose a smartphone ban. And I did hear an absolute mad shit. Sorry, it was a recording. Probably shouldn't say that, but I did hear a mad shit proposal with a school the other day who have proposed a blanket ban. Now, I've not got too many issues with smartphone bans in school, but some parents were pushing back, going, but we use that phone to track the kid because we need to know where they are, because we're worried about them because of the paedophiles. And the school has proposed that they just buy an AirTag instead, because then you can still track your kids and they won't need a smartphone. No one's going, oh, why do you need to know where your kid is in school? That's a bit weird, isn't it? And the step forward from that is, if you look at sentencing guidance around domestic abuse, GPS tracking is viewed as an aggravating factor in sentencing. So it's viewed as worse if you are using tracking. So on the one hand, we're going, we need to be able to control our kids and track our kids, and we need to get them used to being surveilled. On the other hand, we're saying for adults is really problematic behavior. So, we enacted the UN Convention of the Rights of the Child in 1991. We, as a nation, agreed that children having rights was a good thing in 1991. And most of countries in the world have ratified the UN Convention of the Rights of the Child. And I spend a lot of time with the UN Convention of the Rights of the Child. When you start to unpick the UN Convention of the Rights of the Child, there are plenty of articles in there that suggest that children do have a right to privacy. We should act in their best interests. They have evolving capacity, so we have to acknowledge that. We have to include the voice of the child in these sorts of things. But then you get a pushback going, yeah, but in order to keep them safe, we have to erode some of those rights. And yes, these rights are not absolute, but that doesn't mean that you say, oh, right, we're concerned, therefore we can just pull privacy. You have to justify it as evidence-led. It has to improve children's welfare. It doesn't undermine autonomy, and children's voices were considered. Now, I spend quite a lot of time visiting schools and colleges, talking to young people about these sorts of things. I've never met a young person that says, can you ban encryption, please, because of the paedophiles, or can you bring big tech billionaires to heel, please? Loads of them say things like, can we have better education around this stuff? And when we speak to a teacher, can they not freak out and tell us we're deviants? And when we ask questions, can we get better answers? Very few of them say, can we have better technical circumvention in order to be able to restrict our rights, because we appreciate that these rights are not absolute and we don't deserve them, in cases where we might be doing something that is perceived by somebody to be risky. I'm being facetious, but that's kind of where the discourse is going. And the consequences become, you do have this downward spiral, which is where it's going. And as I said, quite selfishly, it's useful to me because it gives me stuff to write about. And I do enjoy writing about this stuff. But if we're talking about outcomes for young people and outcomes for society as a whole, it's far more problematic, because if you are saying this is something that might potentially be used for something that could potentially be used to harm children. Someone was telling me the other day that Roblox is dangerous. Oh, shit, is it? Like, literally millions of kids use that. Um, or is it that there are certain scenarios in Roblox where there is problematic behavior going on in certain games, and it would be good to have safeguards against that? But their view is Roblox is dangerous. Wow, that's really quite concerning, because I know loads of parents whose kids play that. So yeah, and when the conversations become too dumb, and I guess for those of you that have joined this call, you are going to be leading the technology edge of this stuff. And it's something I do have conversations with people in the tech sector about. It's like, when do you start pushing back on this stuff? Because you are the people with the technical knowledge. You are the people that understand this stuff better than other people. It's fine to acknowledge the fact that maybe you should do better risk assessments, do better, data protection impact assessments, do better duty of care analysis. But you can't say that we have the technical means to solve all of these problems, because it's simply not the case. And Marcus Raynham, a very famous cybersecurity researcher in the 90s, came out with this wonderful statement that I always go back to in these situations, which is, you do not solve social problems with software. And the problem is, in this space, the technical solution is always a predominant one, probably because other things are too difficult, like better education, adults not freaking out when a disclosure happens, and all those sorts of things. So, to finish off, to conclude, the VPN debate really pricked my ears, because it really is a case of how far are you going to go with this nonsense? But it should be framed within a historical context of governments keep on trying to do this thing and they never succeed. Therefore, why do they keep on doing them? And then it gets back to, well, what else can they do that works in a 5-year policy cycle? And they can say, this has been successful. I did promise someone, because I go on Radio Cornwall quite a lot because I quite like them, and they were asking me about the Australian social media ban. And the Australian social media ban is, we are told, because there's a children's mental health crisis in Australia, and that's social media's fault. And I did say I'll go back in 3 years and talk about why there's still a children's mental health crisis in Australia, which he said I was quite confident about that, and yes, I am. But that's the problem with these things, is they're viewed as solutions rather than parts of a bigger puzzle. I shall finish there. Hopefully that was of interest.